I appreciated the words of encouragement this morning because it's hard to continue to live day in and day out sometimes in our faith because there's a lot of things that discourage us and distract us. I was thinking about this morning about the calling that we have on each of our lives and the calling to be the light of the world, to be a hope. Like Sheila was talking about, like Bishop was talking about, like Amanda was talking about keeping our eyes focused. And the verse from Isaiah 9 came to light that said that those who walk in darkness have seen a great light. And I was thinking about this morning because in light of all the news that continually is blasted on the news outlets and stuff, and the tragedies that we see, and the things that we go through, and we always just say, how can someone live like that? Well, these are people that walk in darkness. Right. These are people that haven't had their eyes open to the light. We're once again in the midst of another election year, and it's just as bloody and brutal as it was 2 years ago, and will be 2 years from now, and 2 years from then, and it's just a constant battle. And everybody's on edge, and everybody's angry, and everybody's upset because they walk in darkness. Amen. But those that walk in darkness will see a great light. And what is that light? That light is a reflection of Jesus from us. Amen. We're the ones called to be the great light, but it's hard because we're dealing with our own stuff too, isn't it? Yeah. Well, I want to give us hope this morning. I want to give us encouragement this morning. In fact, I wore my best Mr. Rogers outfit in order to give you hope and to be comforted this morning. Because we are called to be the representation of light, ambassadors of hope to the world. The world is in darkness, but let's let them see the light of Christ in us. Today's gospel reading is all about darkness. Blindness, in fact. Bartimaeus. Who here has seen some of the classic movies, like Rocky? Anybody seen Rocky, or all 5, 6, 7 versions of it now? What about other movies that have that kind of message? Remember the Titans, or even the Mighty Ducks, Disney's Mighty Ducks. What about the movie Rudy? Did you see the movie Rudy? You know, the kid that wanted to play football for Notre Dame, but he was small and tiny. Then there was classic movie Hoosiers. Gene Hackman played the coach, and the movie Miracle about the U.S. Olympic hockey team. These are classic films that we love, films that we may have seen numerous times. And what do all these films have in common? The underdog, exactly. It's the underdog story. Maybe the poor kid or the poor team or the smaller guy that just shouldn't be able to compete with the bigger and stronger opposition. And yet, through grit, determination, maybe even a little luck, not only are they able to compete, but they come out victorious. Rocky Balboa versus Ivan Drago. Average Joe's Gym versus the Globo Gym Purple Cobras. David versus Goliath. Small and weak versus big and strong. And who doesn't love a rags to riches, up to the challenge, face the giants type of story? We all do. And you know what? So does Jesus. No other figure in history is seen showing as much compassion and attention to those in need of him. The outcast, the downtrodden of society, where was Jesus? Where Jesus made his home. I mean, if you think about it, from his lowly beginnings, right up to the moment of his death, and thereafter, he was seen with his life spent seeking out those and serving those in need. Even on the way to the cross, he is still showing compassion to others, telling the women, don't cry for me. Don't cry. John, here's your mom, take care of her. In the midst of being on the cross, telling his mom, this is your new son, he'll look after you. Always looking out for the needs of others. Maybe that's why we relate so well to Jesus today. You have problems, Are you facing an uphill battle? You feeling down and discouraged? Well, that's exactly where you'll find Jesus. What is it he promises us? I'll never leave you, and I'll never forsake you. Jesus is the champion of the underdog. July 30th, 2007, the McDonald family was fast asleep. Their air conditioner wasn't working properly, so their 15-year-old daughter, Shea, was camping out in the cooler guest room right next to her parents' room. Mom and Dad, Jeannie and Kevin, were your average American couple. The family lived in Chelmsford, Massachusetts. Suddenly, Shea woke up with a knife at her throat. The man holding it was trucker Adam Leroy Lane. Within the past 2 months, he had broken into houses in New Jersey and Pennsylvania, murdering 2 women and injuring another. Now he was ready for victim number 3. Only that day, Lane had picked the wrong house. Despite a hand over her mouth, Shea let out a muffled scream, and since the AC wasn't working, her parents heard the noise and went to check on her daughter. When they opened the door, they saw a man in a ninja mask dressed all in black, and they both sprang into superhero mode. Kevin was only 5'9" and 160 pounds. His wife was 135 pounds and 5'1". Both were sleepy, empty-handed, and in their underwear. And as for Lane, he was 245 pounds and 5 feet 11 inches, carrying 2 knives, a throwing star, and a garrote. But that didn't stop Kevin from taking Lane to the ground. Next, the desperate father threw himself on top of the killer, but like in a horror movie monster, Lane staggered back up, with Kevin holding on for dear life. Then Jeannie moved in, grabbing for the blade, slashing her hands in the process. While she wrestled for the weapon, Kevin put Lane in a chokehold while their daughter dialed 911. The battle lasted for 4 minutes until the cops arrived. As the officers hauled Lane away, Kevin kept his action hero cool and muttered, "Get that scum out of here." Lane would later earn life sentences, and while the McDonalds were traumatized, they all escaped with their lives. Of course, maybe they weren't such underdogs after all. According to Kevin, he said, "We had angels watching over us that night." Man, we love a story that ends that way, don't we? Too many stories end badly. Too many stories end in tragedy. We love it when the good guys win and the bad guy is defeated. It's easy to get discouraged about our life at times. Maybe the promotion didn't work out, or the relationship fell apart, or maybe there was something more tragic that we encountered. And if you have been around the block a few times in your faith, I know with certainty that we can attest that God held us close during those difficult times. Amen. And even more comforting than His promise to never leave us on earth is His promise for eternal salvation. Never-ending joy and peace and fellowship with Him and with each other. This is the hope that we have. And I don't know what we're going to be doing in heaven. I have no idea. I think the best I can imagine won't even scratch the surface of what really goes on. But there is one thing that I hope. I really hope that there's a 24-hour buffet table. And that we can feast together without ever gaining any weight. Wouldn't that be great?
Yes.
I mean, and that's the best that I can imagine. So I'm sure it's going to be way better than that. Today's gospel reading stars a real underdog character, Bartimaeus. Or blind Bartimaeus, as he has become known. He's kind of like Doubting Thomas. Blind Bartimaeus is known for one thing, being blind. That was it. Now, blindness is perhaps one of the most challenging, or maybe the most challenging of all disabilities. Why? Because you are forever at the mercy of others. Now, in today's society, we know for a fact that someone who is blind can definitely lead a productive life. But they're still dependent upon others to take them places, drive them, whether or not they can take the bus or whether they have a friend or something. They can't get around on their own very well. And even if they are walking in a street with the stick, I mean, they can't hear and see things and all the stumbling blocks. I mean, crossing a street can be a challenge. Navigating through crowds or busy places. And if you think being blind today is difficult, just imagine what it was like in Jesus' time. A blind man could do only one thing: beg. And we can't forget the fact that most people at that time looked at their handicap or their blindness with disdain. There was perhaps some thought in everyone's mind of this is retribution for some sin in their life. The disciples mirrored that thought when they asked Jesus. They saw a different blind man. They said, who sinned? This guy or his parents? That he should be born this way. Blindness, handicap, disease, disability, anything like that was a direct result of sin, and it was punishment from God in their minds. A blind man could only beg for a living, and most people would shun him because he was viewed as cursed. I mean, maybe they would help him out of pity, but the truth is they probably felt, you deserve this for something, so why should I bother? You have to live out your penance. A guy named Charlie Boswell was blinded in World War II while rescuing a buddy from a burning tank. Charlie had always been a great athlete, so after the war he took up golf. And he was really good at golf. In short, in fact, he won the National Blind Golf Championship 16 times, once shooting a score of 81. Anybody here golf? Can anybody shoot an 81 with perfect eyesight? 1958, Charlie went to Fort Worth, Texas to receive the coveted Ben Hogan Award in honor of one of the greatest professional golfers in history. When Ben Hogan met Charlie, Charlie asked him to play a round of golf with him. Ben agreed. Charlie said, would you like to play for money? Hogan said, well, that wouldn't be fair. Charlie said, come on, Mr. Hogan, are you afraid to play a blind golfer? Hogan was pretty competitive, so he said, okay, I'll play you for money. How much? Charlie said, how about $1,000 a hole? Hogan said, well, that's a lot. How many strokes do you want me to give you? Boswell said, no strokes. We'll play straight up. Hogan said, Charlie, I can't do that. What would people think of me taking advantage of a blind man? Boswell smiled and said, I wouldn't worry about it, Mr. Hogan. Our tea time is tonight at midnight. Charlie Boswell was a remarkable man. He did not let his disability deter him from having a fulfilling life. Bartimaeus' story is much different. It takes place just outside Jericho. Now, when we think of Jericho, we think of it in Joshua's day, right? Joshua and the Battle of Jericho. And that is a wonderful story. But it's really no more thrilling than the story of Bartimaeus. Remember, Jesus and his disciples are making their way to Jerusalem for Passover. Mobs of people are heading to Jerusalem for the same reason. And Jericho is very close to Jerusalem. It means the streets of Jericho were filled with people on their way to the holy city. And that was important to Bartimaeus. These were primitive times, and through no fault of his own, he was a beggar. Crowded streets meant that he might receive a bit more generous day's wage than normal. And as you're probably aware, there were no government programs to help him in his day. Unless he had family to look after him, life would indeed be cruel. By the way, do you know where the word handicap comes from? Until relatively recent years, there were no programs to help the disabled. Their only source of income was to stand beside the road with their cap in their hand, begging. Thus the word handicap. As we know in society today, people with disabilities are not the prize that they once were. In fact, many great accomplishments have come from the minds and hands of people that have suffered with some form of handicap or another. But that was not so in Bartimaeus' day. That day in which he lived, opportunities for work for the blind man, other than begging, were just non-existent. At least on the day that our story takes place, the streets will be clogged with people, giving Bartimaeus the opportunity, perhaps the hope, to receive more than the usual paltry amounts that he would normally get in alms. But little did Bartimaeus know that this would be no ordinary day. An itinerant preacher was passing by the place where Bartimaeus was begging, Jesus of Nazareth. Now obviously Jesus' reputation had spread to Jericho, because Mark's gospel tells us that as soon as Bartimaeus heard it was Jesus passing by, he began to shout, Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. Somehow he knew enough about Jesus to know that Jesus was of the house and lineage of David, and that Jesus could help him. Perhaps Bartimaeus was already one of those who believed in Jesus as the Messiah. Perhaps he was well acquainted with Isaiah's prophecies. Those who walk in darkness will have seen a great light. Perhaps he heard some of other Isaiah's prophecies that say throughout Scripture and through numerous times that the Messiah would come. And one of the things the Messiah would do would heal the blind. He believed, perhaps, that this was the Messiah. He believed the Scriptures, perhaps, and said, this guy can do something for me. So he started shouting. He started calling out to Jesus. Well, what happens? This makes everybody else uncomfortable. The bystanders nearby, they start rebuking him. They tell him to be quiet. That just makes him shout all the louder, all the more. Son of David, have mercy on me. Then something dramatic happened. Jesus stops and calls him. Now, how did Jesus possibly pick Bartimaeus out of that crowd? There were probably tons of people there. All kinds of people pressing around him. Was Bartimaeus that much of a disturbance? Or was Jesus just that tuned in to the cries of the broken and the hopeless? See, this gives me hope either way. Are you hurting in need of the touch of the Messiah? Well, Jesus knows our pain and hurt, and he responds to desperate people. So they called to Bartimaeus, cheer up, on your feet, he's calling to you. Bartimaeus then does something amazing. He jumps up. He runs to Jesus, but Scripture says specifically that he threw his cloak aside and jumped to his feet and came to Jesus. Now, he's a blind guy. He doesn't have a lot of possessions. Scholars tell us that a blind man to throw aside his cloak is a very risky thing to do. What if he wasn't able to receive it? He certainly couldn't stop anyone else from taking it. His cloak may have been the only thing that he owned. A blind beggar would need a cloak, would depend on a cloak. This was the only way he could be out in the streets. A cloak doubled as your protection from weather. It doubled as your pillow. It doubled as a blanket. It doubled as everything. The cloak was the most important thing that a person in Jesus' time owned. Could it be that Bartimaeus had enough belief in Jesus that he thought perhaps he'd be healed and no longer need of a cloak for begging? Or maybe he was so enthusiastic about Jesus calling for him that he just simply acted without thinking. He runs to Jesus. Jesus says, what do you want me to do for you? Bartimaeus replies, Rabbi, I want to see. Now notice this. As extraordinary as this request was, he wasn't asking for anything beyond that which you and I take for granted. He just wanted his eyes to work properly. He wasn't asking for a cushy lifestyle. He wasn't asking to meet the woman of his dreams. All he was asking for was simply to be able to see so that he could find a job and enjoy the beauties of life that all of us enjoy. Jesus knew what kind of man Bartimaeus was, and he granted his request. Go, said Jesus. Your faith has healed you. Mark tells us immediately that Bartimaeus received a sight and followed Jesus along the road. And there's some things about him that I think are really important and that jump out as we read this story about Bartimaeus. The first and most obvious thing about him is that he was disadvantaged. He was handicapped. He was blind. Now, a lot of people have fallen into this category. Bartimaeus probably was not the only disadvantaged, but because of his disability, he was also rejected. Even his name. What does his name mean? Son of Timaeus. He didn't even have his own name. He was so rejected, he was just known by, hey, this is Timaeus' kid. Interestingly, though, of all the people in the Bible that Jesus healed that was blind, this is the only one that is called by name. Bartimaeus is the only one. Everyone else is a blind man, a man blind from birth. The blind man here, that Jesus does this. No name except for Bartimaeus' name. Although it wasn't a great name, because it really was he was known as who he wasn't versus who he was. We don't know his real given name. He was not important enough to have been called anything except the son of Timaeus. Religious people were probably a small comfort to his feelings of rejection. As we know from reading the New Testament, there were many people in that time that felt that a disability was a punishment by God. In their ignorance and superstition, They actually felt that if someone sinned, then they would be born as a result of this. How many hearts, perhaps, have been broken because of someone's outrageous interpretation of adversity? I think in that time, and I think through our time, we still hear that today. We still hear people that judge people's lives and circumstances and shed God in a terrible, terrible light. Amen. Probably Bartimaeus had put up with a lot of this. He was blind and he was a beggar, and he was most definitely a social outcast. His situation was like that of the cat that was found in London. Its finders advertised to find the owners, and this is how they described the cat in their advertisement. They wrote, "Kitten found with white paws and bib, very affectionate. Answers to the name, go away." There must have been times when Bartimaeus felt like his name was go away. Most of us don't like to be approached by a beggar, do we? We see them around and it's uncomfortable. It makes us feel uncomfortable. We don't know always how to respond. It's easier just to let them pass by. It's easier to keep the windows rolled up and pretend that we're talking on the phone, that they're standing on the side of the road. It's uncomfortable. We start to think, well, they're in this position because they did something to deserve it. Do we sound like the disciples? Go away. Bartimaeus was disadvantaged. The truth is, all of us are to a certain extent. All of us have shortcomings. Now, they may not be physical. They may be emotional. Perhaps one of the most dangerous disabilities is that of living a privileged life. Why? Because we never get to develop the mental and emotional and spiritual toughness that is required for dealing with life situations. You going through hard times? Good. It's giving you practice. Giving you the ability to trust God. We talk about this every year at Lent. Why do we do Lent? Because it helps us practice sacrifice for the times when we have to do it without a choice. Bartimaeus was disadvantaged. But look at something else. He wasn't defeated. When Jesus came by, Bartimaeus started shouting, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." And when Jesus called for him, he threw off his cloak, jumped to his feet. I love that picture. A blind man leaping in anticipation. Bartimaeus was disadvantaged, but he was not defeated. He was not going to let the people around him tell him to be quiet. When he saw the opportunity for healing, he jumped at it. He wasn't like the rich young ruler who came to Jesus saying, "What must I do to be saved?" and turned away sadly when he was asked to do too much. Neither was Bartimaeus like the man at the pool of Bethesda, who when Jesus asked him if he really wanted to be healed, he made many excuses for his situation. See, Bartimaeus wanted to see, and he was willing to pay that price to achieve the goal, at any cost. He would not be defeated. What a difference such an attitude makes in life. Thank God for the Bartimaeuses of this world who would not be denied by their circumstance. I recently read about the building of the famed Brooklyn Bridge in New York City. It was an engineering marvel. It was completed in 1883, and it's known for its granite towers and steel cables. The bridge took 14 years to build, and at least 24 people died in the process of building the bridge, including its original designer. The designer was an engineer named John Roebling. When Roebling came up with the idea of building this massive suspension bridge over New York City's East River to connect the boroughs of Manhattan and Brooklyn, everyone thought he was crazy. But John and his son Washington set out to prove that it could be done. After only a year into the construction, John Roebling was killed in an unfortunate ferry accident, which left his son, young Washington, an inexperienced engineer in charge of the bridge. But this was just one of the tragedies that befell the Roeblings. Since part of the bridge was being built underwater, many workers began to suffer from decompression sickness due to the difference in pressure below the water and above it. Young Washington himself suffered from this condition to such an extent that he became paralyzed, deaf, and mute. Can you imagine what this would have been like? But this still wouldn't stop him from building the bridge. Able to move just one finger, Washington devised a system by which he could tap on his wife's arm to communicate with her. He continued to direct the construction of the bridge from his bed, giving instructions to his wife, who then passed them along to the crew building the bridge. For the next 11 years, Washington continued to work in this way until 1883, when the Brooklyn Bridge was completed and opened for use. And what a success it was. 135 years later, the Brooklyn Bridge still carries more than 150,000 people each day safely to their destinations. You have to admire any person who through faith and determination refuses to be defeated. Blind Bartimaeus was one of those people. He was disadvantaged, but he refused to be defeated. And he was rewarded for his determination. Jesus said, "What do you want me to do?" Bartimaeus says, "Master, let me receive my sight." I love Jesus' response. When everyone else told Bartimaeus to just go away, Jesus says, "Go your way. Your faith has made you well." What a wonderful gift Christ gave him. You and I take our vision for granted, and we shouldn't. The gift of sight is one of the most precious gifts that God can bestow upon us. James Craft, in his book, Adventures in Jade, tells us about a great turning point in his life. He said he was 14 years old and one of the family of the 11 children living on a farm in Canada. Because of a serious problem with his eyes, James could not distinguish objects clearly. He compared his vision to a blurry image of a boat seen from underwater. Just as discouraging, his nearsightedness was so acute and so distressing that he also suffered continuously from furious headaches. But in the providence of God, there was an eye doctor vacationing in the vicinity of James's home. Young James began taking care of the eye doctor's horse and buggy. Noticing James' extreme nearsightedness, the eye doctor insisted that the boy go to the city with him and be fitted with a pair of glasses as his gift. And James did so. Here's how he described what the gift of improved vision meant to him. He said of the eye doctor, he said, "He gave me the earth and all that was in it, completely in focus and beautiful beyond anything I could have dreamed. I cannot think of another act of human kindness in my lifetime which could compare to this." I think Bartimaeus would have known how young James would have felt. His world was totally dark when Jesus gave him the gift of sight. Helen Keller once wrote a magazine article entitled 3 Days to See. In that article, she outlined what things she would like to see if she was granted the gift of sight. The first was that she said she'd want to see her friends. Day 2, she said she would want to spend seeing nature. And the third day, she would spend in her home city of New York, watching the busy city and the work day of the present. She concluded with these words. She said, "I, who am blind, can give one hint to those who see. Use your eyes as if tomorrow you were stricken blind." See, this is why Bartimaeus became a follower of Jesus. Listen to the last words of the story. Jesus said to him, "Go your way. Your faith has made you well." And immediately, Bartimaeus received his sight and followed him on his way. Bartimaeus became a follower of Jesus Christ. How could he do anything else? All his life he'd been blind. And finally, this man, Jesus, set him free. He could see. What greater gift could anyone give him than that? Remember Fanny Crosby, the hymn writer. She also was blind since childhood. But in many ways, she could see more than others. She wrote the hymn, "Pass me not, O gentle Savior. Hear my humble cry. While on others thou art calling, do not pass me by." It's a wonderful hymn. And we need to know that Christ will not pass us by if we are truly seeking him. He sees our needs, whatever they may be. You know, Bartimaeus was disadvantaged, but he was not defeated. He came to Jesus, and Jesus healed him, and he became a Christ follower. Bartimaeus is a living example to us. His blindness is not that much different than ours, or the disciples to the story. See, Bartimaeus was literally blind. But a worse kind of blindness exists. Spiritual blindness. And see, this is what we all suffer from a lot. When Jesus began his way into Jerusalem, he told the 12 of the dreadful things that would befall them. And it was not the only time he spoke of that coming agony. 3 times Luke records that Jesus tried to warn them. On the first occasion, Luke writes, "But they understood none of these things." On the second occasion, he writes, "But these things were hidden from them." And on the third occasion, Luke records, "But they did not grasp what he had said." See, the disciples were blind as well. They were just as blind to the nature and person of Jesus. Yeah, they loved him. They loved him passionately, but they didn't understand him. They were spiritually blind. They had sight, yet they failed to see. They were blind to the meaning of the events that were happening all around them. And the blindness affected their behavior. Look what they did in the story. They tried to keep the poor beggar from coming to Jesus. Bartimaeus is calling out, I'm blind, help me, help me. And they're saying, shut up, leave him alone. Not only did they keep the blind guy, they tried to keep children away from Jesus and other people that were deemed less important. See, we expect these kind of actions from the Pharisees and Sadducees, but these were the guys that genuinely loved Jesus and knew what he could do. Why would they want everyone to come to him? It wasn't until the stone was rolled away on that Easter Sunday morning that the disciples were finally able to see Jesus for who he was. It was then that they at long last understood the man and his message. It was then that they became apostles instead of disciples. It was then that they brought people to him and moved mountains for him. It was then that they went out into the street and preached the message of the gospel of Christ and brought the world to the feet of Christ. But they could only do these things once they could see. So where are we today? In what ways are we blind like Bartimaeus? In what ways are we blind like the disciples? You see, Bartimaeus lacked eyes, and the disciples lacked knowledge. But we have both, and yet we still fail to see. We don't see the precious gift of life itself. Life can be wonderful. It should be. It can be. But it won't be until we open our eyes. We don't see the blessing of physical health until a severe illness strikes. Then we wonder how we could have gone so long without giving thanks to God for our health. But we do.